Now, it was, of course, medieval in its barbarity. 12 people massacred for lampooning a religion. But then medieval barbarism is the Islamist weapon of choice in its mission to snuff out freedom and democracy. There will be more of it. Given the nature of the target, we decided it was too close to home for us to ignore. So here's my roundup of this week's events in Paris. Ever since the carnage in Paris, every journalist, every media company has had to think the unthinkable. What would we do if a couple of thugs armed with AK-47s came storming through our front door into our newsroom? We know it was an attack on free speech, a free press, liberal democratic values. We also know it was an attempt to intimidate us. Consider ourselves intimidated. It was also the security service's worst nightmare, a professionally executed attack by homegrown terrorists who were trained, bloodied, battle-hardened on some foreign jihadi field, better armed than the local cops, operating alone or in a small group, not part of a network, intent on random, unpredictable acts that don't require much planning, unlike 9/11 or our very own 7/7. All of which makes it much harder for the security services to detect and thwart. Now, our anti-terrorist forces have had their preemptive successes, as have France's, but 100% success, that's well nigh impossible. As one senior British spook put it to me, it is almost inevitable that what happened in Paris will happen here in Britain too, and sooner rather than later. It's a pretty grim prospect, and all of Europe faces it. Years of economic stagnation and mass unemployment have already propelled the hard-right National Front to the top of the opinion polls in France. Anti-Islamification demonstrations have broken out in Germany, and even in tolerant, moderate Sweden. The third largest party is now nativist, anti-immigrant, and it holds the balance of power. Paris has poured petrol on fires they were already stoking. As journalists, we are cowed by what happened to Charlie Hebdo. Some say that they went too far, that they brought it on themselves. We don't need to go there, perhaps. Except we also need to remember that extremism always flourishes best when people dare not laugh at extremists. And since we recorded that film, the head of MI5 in this country has said that there have been 20 planned attacks on the West in the past 18 months, including some on Britain. Most of them have been thwarted, but there are still more coming down the pipeline. We're joined by David Aronovich. Welcome to the programme. Michael, let me come to you. There's been a great talk about broadcasters, journalists being intimidated following this week's events. But the truth is, I guess, is that they already are intimidated.
Yes, I mean, it's notable that no British newspaper today carries the cartoons which were obviously the subject of this attack. I think normally you would have expected perhaps all newspapers to have carried the cartoons so that the public could have known what it was about, the public could have made a judgment, but the fact is that no paper has done that. And I think I heard the editor of The Independent this morning being frank enough to say that this was an element of self-censorship.
David, you think that this phrase, "Je suis Charlie," that actually it's wrong in a way, because we aren't. And we made Charlie Hebdo a target because they were actually just about the only people brave enough to do these things.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I mean, the first thing that should be said, it ought actually, images of Muhammad ought to be banal. In the same way that images of Jesus are banal and so on, because here is somebody who, by reputation or by history, has an enormous impact upon the world upon which we live, and therefore you would expect just in the normal run of things that people would represent him or it or the religion and so on satirically and in any other way. Maybe not back in the 1600s we wouldn't have done, but certainly we do. Certainly we do now, and yet we don't. And there's a reason for that, and the reason for that, I mean, a little bit of the reason is actually because organisations like the BBC and newspapers don't like to give offence gratuitously. And the first thing I was told when I first came into journalism at London Weekend Television, don't offend the Catholics. And this was for two reasons. Firstly, just don't offend the Catholics. This is not a very good thing to do. And secondly, they made a hell of a fuss, and a kind of organised fuss, and you'd feel it if they did.
So they didn't come with AK-47s?
They didn't come with AK-47s, and actually we got over the business of not offending people and so on. I mean, people don't, on the whole, people don't do it gratuitously. People like Charlie Hebdo set out to offend, but the fact is that the notion of the image of the Prophet should be banal. Now, what was perfectly clear in this country from the Rushdie thing onwards, from the Rushdie affair onwards, was that there were people who would say, despite the fact that you are not, or you may have been a Muslim or whatever, we are going to try our very best to stop you expressing this artistically, usually satirically, because satire is the weapon none of us like being mocked. I don't, nobody does. And as a result, we've dodged it. And that means that something like Charlie Hebdo just sits above everything else.
And was standing out as a target.
Was standing out as a target. In a sense, we all should have been targets.
Diane, have we been cowed?
I don't think so. I mean, clearly, like Private Eye, I don't see it every week, whatever it is, but their stock in trade is being offensive, and I suspect they're being as offensive to Muslims as everybody else.
Well, you'd be wrong to suspect that, because they're not.
No, they're not.
But let me just, I think the business about freedom of speech is very important. I was a new MP when the Salman Rushdie thing blew up, and I remember one particular afternoon, I had a little office in Stoke Newington, it was full of imams, right? I was a young woman full of imams telling me that I had to come out and condemn Salman Rushdie and speak up for book burning, otherwise no Muslim would ever vote for me in Hackney again. And I had to say, well, if that's what it's going to be, that's what it's going to be. Because they were saying, because I was an ethnic, I had to condemn Salman Rushdie. And I said, but without books and libraries, I literally would not be your MP today. So I think where appropriate, we do have to stand up. I really do.
David, you wrote today that the contract, the freedom that allows freedom of religion in this country is always also the freedom that allows you to satirise religion, all religions, and Hebdo did lots of different religions. But you also said that if you don't accept that free speech takes precedence over the right not to be offended, then maybe you should just leave the country.
What I'm saying is, if you can't live with the notion of freedom of speech and the same freedom that guarantees your freedom guaranteeing other people's freedom, if it's unbearable to you, there are certainly places you can go and live where life is like that. You could quite easily find yourself a trip to Pakistan where you're not allowed to do that, or to other countries, where that's the case. Sorry, I'm not just talking about Muslims. I'm talking about anybody here. Yeah, anybody here who can't accept that that's the deal.
I feel very strongly about freedom of speech, but you know, it's that classic thing. No one has the freedom to shout fire in a crowded room.
Yes, but is what Charlie Hebdo was doing, was that shouting fire?
No, I think that what they were doing, they were quite entitled to do. That was their stock in trade.
Michael.
Well, one of the things we've heard David Cameron say in the last couple of days, and I think the BBC actually says it as well, and we hear it on every single occasion, is that these attacks have nothing to do with Islam, that these are a perversion of the Muslim faith and so on. The fact is, though, that the gunmen are yelling, you know, Allah Akbar. They're talking about revenging the Prophet when they do this. So I think what we require, much more than we've ever had in the past, is Muslim leaders to explain absolutely clearly why it is that this is disconnected from their religion, or to say which parts of the religion have been misunderstood, or to say which parts of the religion need to be reformed if there are people within that religion who are misunderstanding it so badly. I don't think we're there at the moment, and I think we do have the right to look for that.
Diane?
The truth is, though, that the motivation of these youngish men is not ultimately theological. you know, any more than Catholicism was ultimately the motivation for the IRA at its most
But it's
deadly.
totally different. The IRA never used Catholicism or Christianity as a reason for its actions.
I don't understand how you can say it's not theological when what they're doing is revenging the prophet and killing infidels. How can you say that's not theological?
That may be their narrative, but underlying it...
who are you to interpret what underlies their
underlying
narrative?
it? First of all, people that can come and gun down 12 people must have an element of psychopath in their nature, I would say.
Yes.
But also the issue...
Ideology.
Ideology, but not necessarily religion as such.
Well, religion is an ideology. I mean, one of the things that I find very interesting about this when people talk about how... And there are letters to the Times tomorrow saying, well, the problem with Charlie Hebdo was it offended religious sensibilities. There was that famous exchange between Le Carré and Salman Rushdie, because Le Carré had effectively said, who are you to go around insulting great religions? And I've just been writing a book about my parents' communism, and there's a point in 1953 when Stalin dies, just before he dies, and there's some descriptions by communists of Stalin as this towering genius. And I thought, they are describing Stalin in the same kind of terms as somebody might describe the prophet or might describe Christ. So if they were... So why would their offence at a lampooning of Stalin not somehow be not as legitimate as somebody's offence at the lampooning of Mohammed? And the answer is, there is no good reason.
Let me move on to the nature of the attack itself. The attacks are changing from the days of 9/11 or even 7/7, and there are not. If you look back, Bin Laden had the caves of Afghanistan and a rather backward place in these days called Kabul. They now have big chunks of Syria, big chunks of Iraq, big chunks of the Yemen, big chunks of the Maghreb, lots of money, lots of people ready to train them. It's a more dangerous threat than ever, I would suggest.
And in a way, it's an even greater terror. I mean, you mentioned Stalin. Of course, you know, under Stalin, the terror was that certain groups of people knew that they might be eliminated. This has put journalists on notice. I mean, apparently the gunman went in and called the journalists out by name.
They called out the names of the cartoons. They had a list of the names. It looks like they chose the time when the editorial meeting was taking place.
So this is a new form of terror. Also, by the way, the fact that they are not suicide killers. So they're at large at the moment. So, you know, Paris is at the moment in fear that they may strike again. St Pancras Station apparently is in fear that they may strike again. So that's another wave of terror.
It's a minor point, but I cannot understand how they were allowed to come, gun down 12 people and drive all the way out to Paris. It's like you went to the private eyes offices, machine gunned 12 people and drove to Tottenham. It's not happening. They'd locked down central London. I don't know what happened in Paris.
You do wonder whether it would have happened in London. The other point, David, I was trying to make is that this is happening at a time when Europe itself is not the best shape to handle this.
No, this is an appalling time. We've just had the major Pegida demonstrations anti-Muslim demonstrations in Dresden. And of course, as somebody who finds myself kind of continuously arguing with people about this from if you like, from a liberal perspective, the difficulties that such an incident create in even getting a hearing for the argument that you mustn't judge everybody to be the same and that actually there are very positive contributions and so on. At the same time as sort of knowing things like, isn't it still true that if Israel does something in Gaza, the Muslim community will come out on very large demonstrations, but if something like this happens, then in that case they're hardly there to be seen as well. And I find myself contending in my own head about which of these is the real thing and is the real truth. How do I knock down the sort of the National Front people or the UKIP people in an argument and yet deal with my own misgivings?
Clearly there's no conceivable scintilla of a justification for massacring 12 cartoonists, but it would be very dangerous if societies retreated into Islamophobia as a response to what's happened in Paris.
What do you think of David's point? Because I think it's quite close to the point that I was making, that one would like to see the Muslim community coming out and demonstrating at least as vehemently as everybody else is.
I think there must be a lot of internal discussion in the Muslim community tonight, because it does make it very difficult. Because I'm somebody that, you know, speaks against the anti-immigrant current I see, the Islamophobic current I see, but these kind of things makes it harder.
Okay,
makes it much harder.
David, just very finally on you. Did we all miss a trick in the British media? Should the editors of our national newspapers not got together last night and said, we will all put a Charlie Hebdo cover on our front page this morning.
I would have liked to have seen that, and I'm also chair of Index on censorship, and we've been trying to get people to do that, and to a certain extent we've had some success with some publications. So I would have liked to have seen that, but more to the point, I would like to see, as I said, the creation of such images as banal. I'd like us not to be cowed in the future.
David, thank you very much for being with us.